Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more Alternate History Hub. This time, what if the Russian Revolution never happened? Now, of course, what this is referring to is the October Revolution, in which the communists took power. But of course, in order for that not to happen, then you need February Revolution to not happen, or what you need is the February Revolution to succeed, and for them to actually do smart things and end the war. And do things to counter the communists. But I am assuming that this is probably also meaning February Revolution doesn't happen. And in order for that to happen, you kind of need the Tsar to be smart and do the right things all the way back to 1905. Was that when there was that massacre that happened in, I believe, St. Petersburg? Can't remember. But yeah, go ahead and just see what Cody.
It's 1917 in the Russian Empire, ripe with famine, economic turmoil, and fighting a brutal war under an incompetent czar.
Yeah.
Not the best conditions for stability, and stability didn't last for long.
No, it didn't.
Soon we have the Russian Revolution. To understand the Russian Revolution, it was not actually just one revolt. It was a series
Okay, so he is lumping in both revolutions into one.
Of events, from the overthrow of the Tsar to the eventual rise of the Soviets. The revolution defined Russia for the rest of the 20th century. It gave rise to not only an industrialized totalitarian superpower, but popularized the communist teachings of Marx and funded countless socialists across the world. So what if the Russian Revolution never happened? Since it's made up of two actual revolutions, we will have to theorize if the February Revolution and October Revolution never happened in two alternate timelines. First, a history lesson.
Yay.
If you wish to skip straight to the scenario, click on Putin. What led to the Russian Revolution? Lots of things. The relationship between the Tsar and the Russian people had been falling apart for a few decades before 1917.
Yeah.
The Russian Revolution of 1905
05.
occurred when workers striking for better conditions were gunned down by the Tsar's military guards outside of the Winter Palace. This act enraged the population, causing uprisings and political turmoil. This forced Tsar Nicholas II to create a legislative body to share power with him, called the Duma. He promised reform to keep his government from falling, but never really followed through.
Sounds
Fast
about
forward,
right
World
for
War
a
I comes
monarch.
around and everyone in Europe is jumping onto the war bandwagon. Russia decides to get into the fight. The war is disastrous for the empire, with millions of deaths on the front and a blockade from the Ottomans which caused an economic crisis. People went hungry, and food was on short supply. Resentment for the Tsar sprung up across Russia. They blamed his leadership for the horrendous loss against Germany and felt the war was a wasteful endeavor.
fucking tank.
This began the February Revolution in 1917. Workers in St. Petersburg, named at the time Petrograd, began striking against labor conditions, and then eventually against the Tsar in general. Nicholas sent in troops to quell the riots, however his army mutinied against him and joined the protesters. On his way back from the Eastern Front, the Tsar's train was stopped and captured by rogue Russian troops. Nicholas abdicated his throne, and with nobody to take the throne, the age of the Tsars effectively ended. The February Revolution was over, and in the most part was a very bloodless coup. A provisional government replaced the Tsar's regime, which met opposition from a group called the Petrograd Soviet Council of Workers' Deputies. This group said they represented the interests of the worker, and in most part did it very well. Soviets were actually just elected councils of workers, very much like unions in the United States. Eventually, other Soviets and socialists participated in the government. Socialist parties were formed and leaders were elected in. Alexander Kerensky, a young socialist, rose through the ranks to lead the provisional government. Despite reforming some aspects, Kerensky still wished to continue the war, and this infuriated the wary population. In response to the never-ending war, a new party gained popularity, the Bolshevik Party. Led by Vladimir Lenin, Lenin hated the war, and funded by the Germans, he returned to Russia after living in exile. After a failed offensive against Germany by Kerensky, socialists revolted in the streets. The Bolsheviks were very anti-war, and this platform made them appeal to many Russians. The government suppressed the rioters and threatened Lenin with arrest. He fled to Finland and other party leaders were arrested. This defeat only helped the Bolsheviks. As the war got worse, party membership exploded. By September, party leaders were freed by the government. Lenin returned and aimed to bring his party to power. This began the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's influence but Leon Trotsky's planning, took over the government. After facing more opposition, the Soviets barred non-Bolsheviks from holding power. Lenin believed that communism could only be achieved by a strong, unopposed leader. He saw elections as getting in the way of his goal to an absolute communist utopia. Many opposed the
Pretty uncommunist.
new Soviet government. In opposition formed the White Army, which began to fight the Socialist Red Army. This began the Russian Civil War, and after years of fighting, the White Army was destroyed by the Red Army. In a few years, the Russian Empire had fallen, and out came the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Russia went from one autocratic but incompetent czar to a brutal totalitarian regime. Millions of people died in the period from World War I until the end of the Russian Civil War. Lenin soon died after the war, and in his place rose Joseph Stalin, who would eventually lead to even more millions of deaths under his oppressive policies. So that's a bit to take in, which is why asking if the revolution simply didn't happen isn't that simple. If one event such as the October Revolution was changed, then the history of Russia could be entirely different. So first, what if the February Revolution never happened? Say the Tsar somehow held on to power, even though that's very unlikely, and the revolutions never occurred. The Tsar is never overthrown. In our timeline, when Nicholas II created the Duma, he did it for show, to quell the angry masses who wish for
Okay, so
reform.
we're going with a somewhat more competent Nicholas, one that actually follows through with what he said he was going to follow through with.
The Duma didn't hold any real power. In this alternate timeline, instead of the Russian Tsar limiting the Duma's power, he gives it much of the legislative responsibilities, effectively turning Russia into a constitutional monarchy. However, even with this, it's very unlikely the Tsar could hold on to power, because the most influential factor that led to the fall of his regime was World War I.
I'd agree with
Russia
that.
fought in World War I,
because, you know, the Germans kind of funded Lenin a little bit.
a revolution would be inevitable. Russia never could have won a war against the Central Powers. It was too underdeveloped and ill-prepared. A blockade from the Ottomans hurt the Russian economy, and German victories hurt the Tsar's legitimacy. So for the Tsar to even have had a chance of staying in power, one, he would have had to relinquish some powers to democratic bodies in 1905. And two, Russia would have had to stay out of World War I. Both are very unrealistic and improbable, but for the sake of the scenario, let's just say this does happen. Democratic elements, no war. World War I occurs across Europe, however, Russia stays out of it. So much would be changed for—
You know what? Yeah, I think the Duma wouldn't have really cared much for the Balkans. Yeah. I think democratic, more constitutional monarch Russia, where the Duma have the authority over the emperor, I think that's a plausible scenario where they actually don't get involved.
From Russia not being in the war, it's hard to predict the specifics. Under the Tsar, Russia was a rural agricultural nation with uneducated peasants as a majority of the population. The monarchy did very little to help this and bring Russia as a major developed nation. The Soviet policies were brutal and killed millions, but they still industrialized the nation rapidly and made Russia the industrial might we know today. In this alternate timeline, Russia remains behind the more advanced European countries like Britain or France. It stays agricultural for much longer in this timeline, but, as well, millions do not die under terrible policies. Perhaps the Duma or another Tsar could industrialize the nation, but only decades down the road, assuming the Tsar isn't overthrown in another coup. Nationalist movements in occupied Poland, Armenia, and Finland would be an issue that the Russians would have to deal with later on. Russia as a nation would not be seen as a rival as it is in our timeline. Russia would not be the adversary we see it as today in this alternate timeline. The Cold War basically destroyed much of the ties between Russia and the West. Speaking of the Cold War and communism, what if the October Revolution or Bolshevik coup didn't happen? In this alternate timeline, the Tsar is still overthrown and replaced by a provisional government.
we're getting
but
two
instead of
theories
Lenin
today.
and the Bolsheviks taking over, the provisional government stays in power. The government would be socialist, but that doesn't mean they were like the Bolsheviks. They focus on spreading wealth to the farmers and were very much more democratic than the Bolsheviks. The only way the provisional government could stay in power is simply give up in the war against Germany. The war was unpopular, and it was a main reason why the Bolsheviks became popular. If the government signed for peace early on and focused on internal problems, Lenin wouldn't have been much of an appeal. It's difficult to predict how this provisional government would run because, well, it's provisional. I'm not going to predict this. What is known, though, is that if Lenin never rose to power, Russia and much of the 20th century would be very different. Without a communist coup, the Russian Civil War never occurs, millions of Russians never die, and the Romanov family is never murdered by the Red Army. In this timeline, without the Soviet Union, the ideology of Marx is never as influential on the global scale. In this alternate timeline, Mao Zedong and his communist army never rise, and so nationalists take control after the dynasty falls in China. Ho Chi Minh could still be a socialist, but Vietnam wouldn't be pulled into a worldwide conflict. Both were funded and inspired by the Soviet Union. In this alternate timeline, communism today is never seen in really any light in the West. It would be a fringe ideology never truly legitimized by a government force. Socialist ideas would have taken shape and spread across the world, but never as the totalitarian dictatorships of Mao and Stalin. In the United States, without the fear of the Cold War and communism, programs labeled off as socialist would probably be implemented in the country.
That is I 100% agree with this. If it had not been for the fucking Soviets, probably there wouldn't be this negative connotation with socialist program, even though taxes socialist. Much government is socialist, kind of. Taxes mainly. Everyone puts their money into the taxes, right, and then the taxes are supposed to go back out to help the people. That's, very basic understanding that is social.
It's difficult to say if Hitler would have still rose to power. Much of his platform was not just opposition to Jews, but communists as well.
Honestly, I would say, in regards to Hitler there, his rhetoric, I think, targeted probably, I would say, the communists just as much as he targeted the Jews.
Without communists, Hitler's rise might have been different. What's the main difference is that Russian culture would have had a chance to grow and evolve, just as the US and Western nations did in our timeline. Communism took away many great elements of Russian culture, which only now are being brought back. Religion was heavily outlawed, and development of new ideas by the Russian people never took shape. In this alternate timeline, Russia's culture would change and develop throughout the 20th century, without being stalled by the Soviets. The Russian Revolution was so influential, we'll never truly know how much it changed our world. These are not 100% predictions because we will never truly know how things could have turned out, but sometimes it's fun to speculate. Like us on Facebook
and that was what if the That was what if the Russian Revolution never happened. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.